Hello everyone. Hello everyone. Firstly, welcome to Arup. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Thompson and I'm going to be your chair for today. I think we can all recognise that we want to tackle climate change. But before we start talking about carbon offsetting, which is today's presentation, I just wanted to kind of emphasise the need that we must be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as our starting point. There is no substitute. And therefore, colleagues in the room will testify my favourite slogan, decarbonise, decarbonise, decarbonise. However, we still have residual emissions. And so what are we going to be doing with those residual emissions which continue to contribute to climate change? And so today's talk is talking about carbon offsetting and can it be a force for good? Now, many of you in the room already have set some fab net zero climate targets. Some of you have also started to purchase carbon offsets from the voluntary carbon market. Now, we all know that the voluntary carbon market is a myriad of a range of spectrums of quality and integrity. And any organisation that is thinking about engaging with the voluntary carbon market needs to be thinking about adequate due diligence and an appropriate strategy. And unfortunately, we have seen an increased number of accusations over the last couple of months around greenwashing and climate inaction, and organisations making false claims against net zero and carbon neutral. So can we be doing better? Now, the IPCC, in all of their models to limit climate change to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, all of them show that we need to increase the amount of greenhouse gas removals. And that number is significant. We need to dramatically increase this. But how are we going to be doing this to address not our current emissions, but also historic? And therefore, does the voluntary carbon market have a role to play? And then finally, collectively, how can we be working together? What should we all be doing? Because climate change is going to impact us all. And therefore, in our focus and our quest just to tackle climate change, we shouldn't ignore the wider issues around sustainability and issues that we have in our society. And therefore can again offsetting be a mechanism to drive these wider sustainable objectives. So big questions for us to start with on a Thursday morning. But I am delighted that we have this wonderful panel of experts who are going to help explore can carbon offsetting be a force for good. So I am delighted to introduce Patrick Greenfield, Dr. Gabrielle Walker, Chloe Goulding and Smith Mordak. So to kick us off, Patrick.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Patrick. I am a reporter with The Guardian and I write about nature, and I'm absolutely obsessed with carbon offsets. It's been something I've been looking into for about 3 years now with my colleagues, and I'm just going to give a 5-minute version of a presentation that I think Chloe's seen at Glastonbury, but I've also kind of been lucky enough to give at universities now and other places. And so carbon pirates, why offsets are not working. Carbon pirates is the term that many indigenous communities in the Amazon use for carbon project developers that are going around looking to buy up their land rights, carbon rights, to set up these schemes so that often we here in the West can buy their credits. Right? This is a huge multi-billion-dollar market and is the reason why many of us are here and interested in this. Right? And so as a news reporter focusing on this subject, I think this is the main question, right? How do we know any of this is real? We are surrounded by these adverts. You can fly carbon neutral, you can have carbon neutral coffee, carbon neutral burgers, you can drive carbon compensated, whatever that means. And all of these adverts here are use RED Plus credits from various carbon standards to substantiate their carbon neutrality claims, right? So these are avoided deforestation credits. And when I first started to see these adverts, and once you notice it, you can't escape it. I remember making eggs with a carbon neutral carton, right? And I'd go and check what the projects were, and there were almost always these schemes. Avoided deforestation is the most popular project type. And I was just trying to kind of unpack, well, what is making this carbon neutral? I understand the emissions from a bottle of water, say, or flying or a burger, but what's the other end? And these are avoided emission credits, right? And we'll talk about removals later on. But what these adverts are saying is, my burger is carbon neutral because we have paid often somebody in a developing country, in Latin America, wherever it might be, to not cut the forest down or to farm in a different way, in theory, right? And but actually, what we wanted to look at was whether there were any independent studies on kind of whether these schemes actually work, whether they do what they say, right? So is it the case, taking these adverts at face value, that deforestation is being stopped on the scale they claim? Is otherwise this is all a mirage, right? And we again, these are avoided deforestation credits, so ultimately we are kind of estimating and checking what would have happened otherwise, right, which is inherently unknowable. But there are now studies looking at the impact of these schemes, and this is what we found. So this is a lot of my work and others over the last year, and we found that once you actually compared some of these studies that were looking at the real impact of avoided deforestation schemes, most of them were either stopping no deforestation at all, according to some metrics, or stopping tiny amounts, right? It depends on the methods you use, and that's an ongoing debate. And I should say everything today is rigorously disputed and by Vera and many of the other organisations involved. But it's had an impact that's a bit surprised me, to be honest. But it's Delta are being sued for their carbon neutrality claim. Lots of companies now have started dropping it, right? And we're still in a world, I've got a minute left, where yes, of course, we're still in a world where we don't quite know what we can trust, what's real, what's not, because this is all unregulated. This is big money, and you can say what you like, and anybody in this room can start a carbon standard if they like. The final thing I wanted to finish on was the non-carbon benefits, right? We do need to absolutely protect these ecosystems to meet our climate targets, and it's a good thing that companies pay for that, right? But we need to make sure these places are actually being protected, and that's very complicated, right? So a company we looked at in detail was Disney. They have done something pretty amazing in theory, right? They've paid to protect a part of a rainforest in northern Peru. I went there last September. It was one of the schemes that seemed to work, but not as much as they were claiming, and we were looking to find out why. What was going on? Was there something that could be kind of saved by this? And what was quite surprising was we found that yes, there were people that were benefiting from this project, and there were people that were in support of it. It was co-run by Conservation International and the Peruvian Park Service. But there were also people having their homes torn down and being cleared and pushed out. And this is a scheme that Apple's bought credits from, some of the biggest companies in the world, big conservation NGOs, that they're investigating this, right? But it's the areas where kind of deep in the forest and forest frontiers are complicated, and this issue doesn't get enough airtime, I think, because when we often obsess over kind of is the credit real or not, right? So very quickly, the three biggest problems I think at the moment with the offsetting industry: integrity, which I'm sure we'll talk more about; benefits to local people, right? We could see a market in the future where it will be a global north, global south thing, I think, where we are paying people to protect places like the Amazon, the Congo Basin rainforest, parts of Indonesia that we absolutely must not destroy if we're going to meet any of these targets. But then there is the spectre of the relationship with, that the carbon industry has at the moment with oil and gas.
Thank you, Patrick. So, some scary things there in terms of that piece of work. So Dr. Gabrielle Walker is going to talk a little bit more about kind of the future and how we can be doing things a little bit better. That's for you.
Thank you. And actually, I want to say thanks to Patrick as well, because this is something that's been clear to lots of people for a long time, that there are serious problems in many of these credits. And I think your work and The Guardian has really brought it out into the open. So I am a co-founder and chief scientist of Curate. And this is a company that we've created to try to help solve some of these issues. And that's our homepage. The science is clear. We need not carbon offsets, but carbon removals. What do I mean by that, and why am I saying it? So this is me, and This is me walking the Camino de Santiago across Spain. I did it in 2020 when it was the middle of COVID, and I was getting extremely restless, and other people sort of said, I need to get out of here, and I said, I really need to get out of here, and I walked 500 miles across the north of Spain. I might have overshot a bit there. But why am I showing this picture now? It's because that was a pilgrimage. It's an ancient pilgrimage, and for 1,000 years, people have been walking across Spain to get to Santiago de Compostela, and I was technically a pilgrim while I was doing it. And I learned a lot about the pilgrimage on the way, and one of the things I learned is that in the past, people would do it in order to have their sins forgiven. They'd walk the pilgrimage so they could get to Santiago, go to Mass, and have their sins washed away. But there was a clever scheme. If you were rich enough, you could pay someone else to do it. And if you paid someone else to do it, they did the walking, but you got your sins washed away. Now, obviously, this is an analogy, and this is what's been worrying me for a long time about the whole offsetting point. We really, really need to stop deforestation, and we need to protect natural carbon sinks. We really need to help the Global South decarbonize in ways where they're not going to happen unless the money actually goes there. But we really need to get away from the idea that we're actually washing away our climate sins, and we need to be looking sensibly and clearly at how we get ourselves to net zero and how we get the world to net zero. And that's the net zero point that I'm now going to bring up. So last time I looked, 92% of global GDP generators had either set their own net zero target or were in a territory that set theirs. Net zero has got really serious, but almost everybody who's set a net zero target has no idea how to get to it. And in the meantime, we've got this nonsense of carbon neutral this and carbon neutral that, instead of saying, how do we get from here to there? How do we get to net zero? And net zero is extremely simple. There's a zero part of it, and there's a net part of it. Basically, the zero part of it is you need to reduce as fast as you possibly can to as much as you possibly can. The net part of it is you have to do something with what's left behind. And that's where carbon removals come in. Because for any individual organization that set a net zero target, the only way to be net zero is you reduce your own emissions and you remove what's left behind. What goes up has to come back down again. What goes up has to come back down again. And it's not just me saying that. The IPCC actually put this up. Carbon removals are now unavoidable for three really important reasons. First of all, it's too late to get down to net zero quickly enough without removals. We actually have to have carbon removals to the order of about 220 billion tons between now and 2050 to have any chance of keeping 1.5 alive. That's the first reason. And that, I was really shocked when I found that out. I've been working on climate change for 30 years, and I was really shocked at that number. Second reason is when we get there, we're still going to have some residual emissions we have to deal with. The third reason is actually my favorite, and it's one that Stephen alluded to, which is we can use removals actually to reverse climate change and restore nature. So those are the three reasons the IPCC said that we need carbon removals, and every single organization or person or country that set a net zero target is going to have to do the zero and the net, which means reducing and removing. So I'm going to romp very quickly through different kinds of removals. People say, oh yes, it's either trees or it's machines. It's green versus tech. It's nature and it's chrome, right? No, there's so many different ways you can do carbon removals. Look at this. So they can do trees are fantastic carbon removal devices. It still blows my mind that they actually make their entire bodies out of thin air. So they're really good at capturing carbon. Problem is, trees can also burn. They can also be chopped down. You've got to do trees right. You've got to put them in the places where they're actually going to survive. You've also got to make sure that you consider the points that Patrick was making about what happens to local people. Are they actually benefiting from this or not? And you've also got to make sure you have the right level of biodiversity, not just planting stands of eucalyptus and saying, job done, right? So you've got to get the trees right. But the other things you can do with wood is you can put them into beautiful buildings like here, and then that wood stays as long as the building's there. You can also turn it into this magical stuff called biochar. If you take wood offcuts and you burn them in the absence of oxygen, the carbon gets locked into them. And then you can spread them on fields, and it massively improves the quality of the soil. I went to see a project that was actually getting young people in Kenya who were collecting rice husks and nutshells, turning them into biochar, selling it as fertilizer. The farmers then were getting fertilizer, weren't having to buy expensive inorganic fertilizer from Europe, but were making their own. Win-win-win. I love this one because it was invented in the Amazon rainforest to improve the quality of the soil by indigenous people there. So it's got nature, it's got tech, and it's got indigenous wisdom, all in one beautiful package. And it's something that you can do locally. Another thing is taking this amazing rock, basalt rock, grinding it up and spreading it onto fields. This rock, it naturally takes up carbon dioxide over thousands of years, but if you grind it up really fine, put dust onto dirt, what you get is two things. You get improved mineral quality of the soil, and you get very rapid take-up of carbon dioxide. This is not nature versus tech, this is somewhere in between. This looks kind of techie. It's one rendition of what you can actually do within seawater. The oceans have been incredibly helpful and wonderful to us. If it wasn't for the oceans, we would already be going down in flames, taking up so much CO2. This is a way to pump seawater through, take the CO2 out of the seawater and put it back in again so that the oceans can actually take up more CO2, and it actually reduces local acidification at the same time. You can have big machines. This is a big machine, or medium-sized machine that I went to visit in Iceland last year. This is actually sucking air through fans over carbon capture devices. You literally catch it in a blimp. It was a big blue blimp, and then you bury it where the sun doesn't shine. I kind of like this one. And it's in some cases, you're actually putting it back where the oil and gas came from. In other cases, like in Iceland, you're actually putting it into fresh lava, where the lava's full of holes. You put the CO2 down, and it goes and solidifies, mineralizes, and there you are, you've got it. So these are the different types of carbon removals. This is all the stuff that we work on: enhanced rock weathering, bio-based building materials, direct air capture, all of that. I've told you all about it. I put all that up because people say, what's the best kind of carbon removal? And I said, that's not what we should be thinking now. We are trying to build this industry out of nothing. We choose removal types that have a chance of scaling to 1 billion tons. That's the kind of level that we're going to need. We choose the types and we choose the projects that have a chance of doing that. We'll know, in 10 years' time, we'll know which ones have really worked. But in the meantime, we're going to have to throw almost everything, so everything everywhere all at once. So we do these portfolios. We're putting all these different techniques together. We're spreading the risk of it not actually scaling. We're spreading the cost because some of them are very much more expensive than others. And we're spreading the durability, not permanence. If anyone says to you, a removal has to be permanent, please smack them for me. Because nothing is permanent except death and taxes. Different things last for different amounts of times. And in fact, we have bands of durabilities for different kinds of removals. I'm speaking faster and faster, aren't I? How am I doing with my 5 minutes? And so, how do you make it happen? How do you make it happen? Because there aren't enough removals out there. That's part of the problem. There aren't enough removals out there. How do we get these projects developed? And the answer is we promise to buy them when they're made. So this thing, advanced purchase commitments, we actually did it with vaccines, where the reason we got a COVID vaccine in 1 year and not 15 or 20 is that governments around the world said, whatever you make, we'll buy. So that kind of advanced purchase commitment, really carefully chosen with carefully chosen projects, is what every bank that I've spoken to has said is the defining thing that will allow us to be able to lend to these projects. I said, what role do long-term offtakes take to one bank? And they said, they're the beginning, the middle, and the end. So advanced purchase commitments, we buy so they can get the project financing so they can build the industry so we can actually help to save the world. So this has actually started with some of the tech companies. Microsoft started it by saying they want to be carbon negative by 2030 and remove their historical emissions. This group Frontier came along with Shopify, Stripe, Meta, Alphabet, and McKinsey. NextGen came along between South Pole and Mitsubishi Corporation. Amazon started doing it. But look, the likes of Airbus are doing it. JP Morgan just started buying these as well. And this is going to be the way that fundamentally we manage to build this industry.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And so now I'm going to introduce, and I have the delight of introducing a fellow colleague, Chloe Goulding.
In preparation for this presentation, I also kind of reflected on the impact that Patrick's article had back in January this year. And actually, for some of us that are working within the offsetting network within Arup, it was a bit of a, oh, yeah, of course. No, yeah, you're not kidding. Yeah, and it was a really lovely moment in a way because it was an opportunity for some of our clients to get engaged with the things that we were getting under the hood at for quite a long time and really ask us some questions that we were asking as well, like what does responsible offsetting look like and what does high quality look like? And at the time, I was being seconded to UK Green Building Council, and it really sparked and enthused me to use my secondment to update the guidance on carbon offsetting and pricing and provide that clarity to anyone purchasing offsets to improve their practices within the built environment sector. So, what is this UKGBC report that I've mentioned? Well, actually, it serves three purposes. It was launched in June this year. It provides guidance for what responsible offsetting is. It describes how internal carbon pricing can be used to accelerate net zero. And then also, as we've just heard from Dr. Gabrielle, it serves as the transition document to try and accelerate removals in line with something called the Oxford offsetting principles. So what it does is it goes through a series of steps. I'm going to go through these steps now fairly quickly, and so we can digest them a little bit more in the panel discussion later. The most important one, you'll see decarbonise, decarbonise, decarbonise mentioned at the top of this slide. It's that absolute clarity around the fact that there's no substitute for deep decarbonisation above all else. And it's about meeting a science-based decarbonisation pathway in line with 1.5 degrees. And so that's what you kind of see there in terms of the purple line on this chart. And that to claim net zero, it's expected that any residual emissions are offset or responsibly offset. And that's how we claim net zero, at least within the built environment sector. So step one, as part of this guidance, is about setting a strategy. Although a lot of people talk about offsetting as an absolute last resort, that is the case, but don't think about it as a last resort. Let's bring it up into the forefront about when you're setting a sustainability strategy, when you're setting net zero targets, when you're thinking about decarbonisation, what are you going to do about your offsetting? And it's really about bringing that and planning for what you intend to do later down the line so that you're trying to understand perhaps what greenwashing claims you might come across later down the line. So the second step is to set a price. Now what you can do, as again Dr. Gabrielle kind of indicated, is that you could set a portfolio of different offsets types. So there are different kind of prices indicated here, and you could set a price within your cost plan so that again you're planning for the future in the order of anything between £10 and £900. It's quite varied. But good practice really says that you should be using carbon cost models that reflect the cost to abate emissions in alignment with a 1.5 degree world. Now these cost models have a bunch of assumptions baked in, so again they can be quite varied, but you can really see there's a big difference here between what the cost of an offset is and what the cost to abate is, and those things really do need to be balanced when setting that price. Step three, this is probably the largest chunk of what the guidance includes, and there is lots of different typologies of offsetting when you're selecting your suite or your portfolio of offsetting projects. But really, if I want to focus, I just want to focus on the reduction and avoidance versus the removal point. So there's a series of graphs here, and essentially a credit, as we've sort of already heard, a credit issued under an avoidance or a reduction mechanism essentially actively reduces or avoids the release of any greenhouse gas emissions against some sort of baseline, had it not been for that intervention or offset project in the first place. But it's the removals that are really capturing and permanently storing that CO2 from the atmosphere and effectively reducing our overall concentration of greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I've mentioned already the Oxford offsetting principles. This is a direct graph from their report that was issued a couple of years ago now. But essentially, if you follow that bottommost line, you can see that the carbon removals, and we can talk about storage and permanence and durability in a bit, but you can see that the carbon removals really do need to ramp up as we get to 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement and the latest IPCC report. And so with that, the guidance sort of takes a series of indicative slices through that graph and provides an indication of what your offsetting portfolio might look like in a series of years into the future. So you can see that by 2025, it suggests a minimum of 50% removals, and it's really about ramping up to 100% removals by 2050. If I pause here, I just wanted to flag that this is something that's within the UK Green Building Council guidance, and it's related to net zero within just the scope of a building. It's slightly different if you're looking at organisational strategy, but essentially the principles that we're talking about today are the same. It's just the methodology and the accounting that you use to get there are slightly different. But essentially, the message is the same whether you're following SBTI or whether you're following the UKGBC guidance. The quicker we can get to removals, essentially the better, and we need to kind of resolve the lack of availability within the market at the moment. last slide. There are a series of focus areas and questions that are included in the report as part of the review, purchase and disclose section. It's really important that we try and encourage everyone as much as possible to be open and transparent within their reporting. That's for others to learn from each other, to understand, to interrogate each other, and really sort of use each other as a collective to try and improve practice within the voluntary carbon market, which can be very tricky and thorny to navigate. So in the last kind of section of the report, there's 2 pages of questions. It asks things like how are the offsets or the purchase governed, how were risks addressed and how were they managed, and also things like which third parties were involved. Often, I think Patrick might agree that a lot of the failings of when you see bad practice within the voluntary carbon market is when lots of people are too involved and it's sharing from hand to hand to hand, and you sort of lose the sense of who's purchasing and actually what's happening on the ground. So that was the whistle-stop tour. I'm looking forward to our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chloe. And finally, Smith.
Thank you all for having me. I went to a talk about a year ago by an actuary, and it was really, really interesting. Then they were sort of saying, like, fast forward 50 years, what do you think the climate target is going to be? Anyone? They're so quiet. Well, the answer was 280 parts per million. It's like, in terms of like, once we've got like this net zero kind of moment that we're in right now, well, we're still sort of hoping some kind of dream that, you know, we're going to maybe be able to decarbonize enough, or the sort of the combination of decarbonization and removals and offsets and so on is like, it's one moment in time. But actually, if we fast forward a little bit further, it's removals, it's removals, it's removals. And I think, and the point that he was saying is like, there are actuary talking about all the risks with this, and like thinking about, and he was sort of talking about how we need to kind of get more on top of ideas around geoengineering solutions, and how do we make sure that those are democratic, and like, and it's like, oh my God, it's so terrifying, seriously so terrifying. And I'm not up here to talk about that, but it's just kind of listening to this conversation. I think, you know, we have to think beyond the kind of the next few years and what we're looking at, and think really, really holistically. Anyway, back to my slides. Thank you, Chloe, for presenting our guidance. It was launched, I think, my second week, so thank you for representing UKGBC there. I'm not going to talk about that. I have made this really beautiful diagram without any help. And thank you. And I just want to broaden it out, I guess, to thinking about a little bit about what are the kind of impacts beyond our immediate value chain. Like part of the, sorry, I'm moving too much. Part of the point around sort of thinking around offsets, around removals, around it's like thinking about what we can do beyond the kind of immediate concerns of our project. So the way I've tried to sort of frame this for myself is that at the moment we have building sites, and we have these kind of, that building sites have this relationship with other places. That could be a quarry or a forest or an ocean or whatever. And at the moment, a lot of the time, that relationship is a kind of extractive, harmful relationship. And so there is this sort of tendency, this kind of feeling that actually maybe what we want to do is sever that relationship because it's harmful and extractive and awful. And we have kind of projects that are talking about like, well, how can we meet all of our human needs without kind of going outside the boundaries of the city in any way? And I think the way that I would prefer to see it is like, how can we see that, you know, we have a relationship between the urban environment and the rural environment, or the building site and a place over there that could be kind of out of sight, out of mind. How can we instead make that relationship a positive, loving, wonderful relationship? And so that kind of encompasses not just a kind of race to the bottom kind of net zero kind of like how can we just make sure that our building doesn't touch anything else, but actually how can we have a positive impact and a sort of a nurturing reciprocal impact with the rest of the world outside of our sort of red line. And I didn't make this one. Liken this a little bit to the way in which at the moment buildings are moving from just passive consumers of energy to active participants within the national grid, within the energy network generally. And so how can we think about that in other ways as well? So I had a couple of slides that I wanted to sort of share about like different ways of thinking beyond your own value chain, beyond beyond the immediate concerns of the project. This one I'm going to skip because it's not very much time. This one I want to say, so I'm really sorry that this example is Amazon, but Amazon's already come up today, so it's fine. It's not me who's bringing it up. So one thing that's interesting here is that basically Amazon wanted to create lower embodied carbon in all of their new data centers, and they were sort of trying to find low carbon concrete. We were talking about this earlier, in order to do that, but found that there wasn't sort of the market, the supply chain wasn't there in the same way. And so what they did was to work with Holcim to invest in the capacity and the infrastructure in order to do that, and then they get their lower carbon data centers, and also that leaves a legacy of then a better sort of lower carbon supply chain that others can benefit from. So in this way, that doesn't really, none of that like counts towards their scope 1, 2, or 3, but it's having a positive impact overall. Or another example, which is kind of similar, is Exeter City Council, who were constructing all of their buildings to passive house standards, and initially that meant about a 20% uplift in the social housing that they were building, but because they were doing it consistently and they sent that clear signal, yes, we're going to keep doing that, overall, just before COVID, that resulted in actually a 4% cost saving. And that meant that many more projects around could incorporate these sustainability strategies in that sense, because it's having that knock-on impact to the wider environment. And again, none of that would get kind of counted within their scope 1, 2, 3, but we need to think beyond those kinds of things. And so the final thing, penultimate thing then, is another, and I can't tell you who this is, unfortunately, but they make a product, and the way that it doesn't matter. They make a product that we use in the built environment industry, and the way that they've like shifted things around is that rather than like banking the carbon reduction across all of their products equally, they kind of are allotting it to specific projects that can then be sold under a this much decarbonized or net zero product, charging a premium for that they then have a kind of mission lock, they don't use that language, but like mission lock to ensure that that investment then goes into decarbonizing their overall value chain. So by kind of shifting things around a little bit, they can then secure an investment into overall decarbonisation that they wouldn't be able to do by sort of moving things down, little bit by little bit. And I think in some ways, this represents a kind of a principle around offsetting wherever that goes. It's about aggregating the resources so that we can do something meaningful. And I think all of those three examples are ways in which we can sort of, whether it's sending market signals or whether it's literally pooling money together in order to do something. And I think the advanced purchase piece is a similar thing. It's about how do we work together to aggregate resources so that we can actually make these things that need to happen. None of this is necessarily going to count in your GHG protocol stuff, but it's still super, super meaningful, and it's still part of creating that positive, loving relationship. I probably don't have time to go into this slide, but I just wanted to say that this approach applies not just to carbon. Yes, of course, I shouldn't have said that thing at the beginning about the actuary, but it's not just about carbon. This kind of approach of reaching out beyond our immediate concerns, beyond our red lines, applies also to biodiversity loss, to habitat loss, to the water cycle. And we've just published this piece about embodied ecological impacts that's looking about how can we use the same kind of mindsets that we've been using for carbon to a whole kind of ecosystem impacts of the built environment. And so positive, loving relationship is the take home there. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you, Steve. So that concludes our kind of presentation. I have a couple of kind of questions, but I thought, seeing as though we're here today, let's open it up to the room. So I think we have some roaming mics. If anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question to our fabulous panel, that'd be great.
This has been mentioned a few times, I think first by Patrick in his first slide, but it's kind of an open question to the panel. There's been a lot of talk recently about redefining the language we use around offsetting and removals, and particularly the purchase of carbon credits. Do you think more nuance or clarity is required in the language you use around those targets, achieving carbon neutrality? And if so, what does that look like?
So I think it depends where you are in the world, right? So, I mean, Apple is still going with the carbon neutral watch. I don't know if, I'm sure many of us saw that advert, but I don't know if they'll be allowed to call that in the EU, for example. I think there's big clampdown on offsetting-based claims there, and I would expect the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK, from my understanding, to be very strict on kind of what you're allowed to say is carbon neutral, if anything at all. The broader point, though, I think the reason for the caution is that, as has been laid out, this is that we're at the start of a new industry, I think, and we should expect a lot of the things in removals and with avoidance credits to fail, right? Not everything's going to succeed. And I was speaking with a former oil trader about this, who's now dealing carbon credits, and it's quite a bizarre thing to be trading in these carbon credits or you don't trade barrels of oil that turn out to be nothing, right? After a 5-year period, it's weird, but that's going to happen a lot in this market, and that's why there definitely needs to be caution with what you're claiming, because you could, despite your best intentions, still be using nothing, right? Even with a portfolio approach and the rest of it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think if the message hasn't got through, really don't call anything carbon neutral. I can't quite believe that Apple, that is so far ahead of so many things, is still making that mistake, but you are going to be clobbered. I was speaking to a big travel industry conference, and they were saying, no, it's all right, we're calling things carbon neutral. And look, there was the Qatar World Cup, and that was the first carbon neutral World Cup, and 3 days later they were clobbered by the advertising watchdog in Switzerland for claiming that, and it's a bang, 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 bang. So really don't, is good advice. But it's also, I think, a really important point that Patrick just made, that we are actually, some things are going to fail and some things are going to turn out to be nothing. I personally think that the only claim in the end that's going to matter, and even not in the end, but in the next year or two that's going to matter, is, are you on track for net zero or are you not? So it's not what have you done now. You can have individual events where you can sort of say, we've carbon removed this or that. I can absolutely buy that. But apart from that, it's basically, am I on track for net zero? And to be on track for net zero, you need to have a plan for reducing and show that you're making it with interim targets. You need to have a plan for removing and show that you're making it with interim targets. And in the end, watch this space. See if I'm right in a year's time, but I think that's where it's going.
Tom, do you want to follow up, or are you all good?
Thanks.
Fabulous.
Can I say a
Smith,
short
please.
thing? Yeah, I mean, totally agree with what has been said. I wanted to say that I think, whereas like maybe a few years ago, a kind of a leadership position would look like saying carbon neutral or something like that. For now, I think what we've been talking about recently is like a leadership position is acknowledging the gap between where we are and where we need to be, and not trying to say like, oh, it's okay, we've got it all covered, it's fine, we're doing this. It's like, that is a shit position. A leadership position is acknowledging, like, this is like, and it's the same as what you're saying really, but just like acknowledging the gap between where the industry is now, and because every single company interlinked with loads of other companies and the sort of the economy and the society around it. So like pretending that you are golden and you have had your sins washed away is like not a leadership position. The leadership position is like, we need to be here. I know we are here, and these are the steps that we're taking to get there, acknowledging that gap.
Brilliant. Thank you, Smith.
Hello, I'm Daewal from Daewal Kang Design, the architect. It's incredible to see the scale of the problem represented in some of the graphs, and I was wondering if people could say something about the roles of organizations of different scales and how they can maximize impact. For instance, when thinking as an architect who does quite nice projects, but with 8-10 people on staff, is the only way to really seriously address the challenge to say, okay, well, we're going to grow to 200 or 500, or are there different ways that different people can innovate and impact this problem at different scales?
Because I've got the mic, I'll say collective action. For example, join UKGBC.
Yeah, I was just going to say something similar to that, exactly that. It doesn't matter what scale you are, everyone has a part to play and everyone has a responsibility in doing this. And if you're not doing something, then I think you're kind of just burying your head in the sand and avoiding it entirely. So it's absolutely about collective action. It's absolutely about everyone coming together, collectively sharing knowledge, being open and honest about what's going on within the industry so that we can all kind of grow together as quickly as possible, because speed is really of the essence here.
I'm going to jump in here. Can I answer your question as well, just before Gabrielle just jumps in there? I think as a role as building engineers and professionals and consultants, a building is an enormous consumption of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, as a role as us as professionals, we can make such a big impact in the way that we can influence not only our designs, but the conversations that result from our practices. So, for example, my life in this year, maybe 8 or 9 tons of CO2 per year. This building, I have no idea, 30, 40,000 tons of CO2. So therefore, the scale that we can make as professionals is massive. So if you're a 5 or an 8 or a 500 team, the impact that we can really make is in our professional work.
So just to add to all of that, I think that we've had a couple of clues already today. One of them is aggregated demand, basically. So that what happens is it builds up and builds up as you get more demand there, and that's going to be the key. And demand signals are what this market actually needs to be able to grow. So that's one point. But another point is that particularly in this space, it's not just that buildings are big consumers of CO2. They're very visible. We live in them. We interact with them. Beautiful buildings get a different kind of attention. So that's almost like it's a different kind of demand signal. It can have an outsized impact. We work with some relatively small issues in terms of the amount of emissions, but very big in terms of the story. So, a carbon removed rock concert or a carbon removed big event that people hear about can actually have an impact in terms of helping people understand the narrative behind this. And it's so confused, as we already heard, all the different terms, all the different ways, all the different things that you can do to bring clarity to it by being iconic. And by helping create something that people interact with can, I think, be really powerful.
Question from Stephen online. On what emission scope should residuals be considered for offsetting and why?
So essentially, to unpick that a little bit, you essentially have scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which relates to different parts and components of the greenhouse gas protocol accounting methodology. There's some emerging guidance from VCMI, which essentially says that you can set a silver, gold, or platinum target for how you're offsetting. And I really think that that's kind of the way that the industry will go in terms of offsetting all of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but with different percentages of each. So I can't remember the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but essentially silver would be something around 20. I'm looking at Stephen.
Oh, I can't remember this off the top of my head.
No, okay, fine. So I'm not going to quote that, but essentially the platinum version is that you're offsetting 100% of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I think that kind of badging and branding might be the way that the industry goes in terms of how you're offsetting all of your scopes or some of your scopes.
I'll make a quick comment on that, which is just to unpick it a bit more. Scopes 1, 2, and 3, how they're actually defined. So scope 1 is your own emissions, scope 2 is the emissions associated with the energy you use, and scope 3 is emissions associated with your value chain. So it's a bit of it was again a really useful framing at the time, but your scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. So in the end, I think scope 3 is going to start to fade as more and more reductions happen, as more and more removals happen as we get closer to the net zero target. But the reason that Scope 3 was invented was that there's so many companies where the vast majority of the emissions associated with their products are actually outside their own four walls, particularly oil and gas companies, obviously, from the way that their products are used, but even the likes of Unilever or big FMCG companies where, Unilever makes a washing powder, but most of the emissions associated with its use come in heating up the water. So the Scope 3 are useful because it gives you an extra way of figuring out how you can help reduce the impact. And I think that Scope 3 is much more important in terms of reductions than it is in terms of some kind of offsetting strategy. But again, kind of watch this space. I think in the next year, 2, 3, then that's going to be more of the focus.
Fab. Any more?
So I'll need to report about this, so I don't think my opinion is right to be expressed on this. It's going to be a hot topic, right? There's science-based targets consulting about this at the moment, and I guess it's not for me to express an opinion, it's to write reports.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
From Mish, are we reducing carbon emissions fast enough in accordance with the amount of companies purchasing carbon credits?
Oh, I know that one. The answer's no. No. Would you like more on that? Because it's very, very clearly no.
Not for now. Any more questions from the room? Oh, lots of hands. Fabulous.
Thank you. Simon Turek from PNZ Carbon, a project developer focused on using the carbon markets to fund the affordable retrofit of the housing stock. I was very taken with Patrick's analysis of the external impact on communities of projects. And so coming back to the topic for today, and assuming that those negative externalities stop happening, how can the voluntary carbon markets be used as a force for good within a community setting? Other benefits that would come in addition to the environmental ones.
This is a really complicated subject, right? Because if we're thinking about environmental integrity, additionality is really important, right? This idea that if you are protecting a rainforest, it would definitely have been cut down without your money, right? Or the same with wind farm in a developing country or whatever. But this additionality is not necessarily useful if you want to, say, support an indigenous community in Brazil that is definitely conserving their territories and has been doing for a very long time, because by virtue of them being there, it's probably not threatened, and you can get into quite weird hypotheticals there, right? But then you have the when I was speaking with a lot of communities in Peru, when there was the Coica Congress, which is a meeting of indigenous leaders from across the Amazon, which happened to be taking place in Lima at the same time, and it was amazing to see perspectives and stories, kind of good, bad, and everything in between about what this is like to experience a kind of Europeans and Americans turning up and saying, "We are the carbon market. Let us let us help you," and there were kind of pretty grim stories about people being offered laptops and contracts in English and kind of sign your rights away and that kind of thing. But then also, I think if there is a developer doing this well, and you're handing over $25 million to a relatively small community that is poor and has lots of problems, that's going to bring its own problems, right? And there were lots of community leaders talking about that and kind of divide and rule. So again, there's not a clear answer, right? Because I think project developers are right. This could be a huge boom industry if done well, and it's important that very significant amounts of the resources do end up, especially when it comes to conservation, with if it's your home, you should probably financially benefit most out of it, right? If you're in a carbon offsetting scheme or carbon project, but doing that responsibly is difficult, and there are ways to manage that, right? Maybe, I mean, we're getting into kind of international development here and that kind of thing, right? But maybe there are kind of caveats about, or kind of stipulations about money being spent on healthcare and rules about how the community kind of needs to decide. But that's a really complicated subject, and I think it just depends on the community, the area. But that's a better problem, right, than some of the ones that we found.
So there's a simple rule, which is it extractive or is it not? I think, and basically as a basic principle, it's either, and this is what we're hearing from Smith as well, it's either extractive or it's not, broadly speaking. And, I just came back from the Africa Climate Summit. There's a lot of talk about carbon markets there. And what I thought was fascinating about it was a big push from the president of Kenya, President Ruto, saying, we want this action. He said he wanted carbon credits to be a bigger export from Kenya than tea or coffee, which is fighting talk. And so while I was there, I was talking to lots of Kenyans. And in fact, I met one extraordinary young woman who is like 23, 24 years old, a Kenyan engineer, and who is developing a direct air capture carbon removals plant in Kenya. Turns out who knew Kenya's actually, and the whole Rift Valley is a brilliant site, kind of like Iceland for direct air capture and carbon removals. I mentioned her because she blew me away. I said to her, "Why are you doing this? How do you feel about it?" And she said she just had this, she was shining with delight. She said, basically, I can't believe I get to use my engineering degree to do something that's actually solving climate change and helping to save the world. She said I had an offer to be a job offer to be an investment banker, and my mum and dad wanted me to take that. But why would I be pushing paper around when I can be doing this? So it's Kenyan engineers and Kenyan companies that are building a Kenyan project with the support of the Kenyan government, and carbon credits from the north can actually help support that. But that's, you know, the one guy there said, this is not going to be done to us, and it's not going to be done for us, it's going to be done by us. And I think that fundamentally is the principle that needs to be addressed around the whole of the carbon credit market in the Global South.
Can I just add one more thing to that, which is slightly different from the kind of global north versus global south thing and kind of sending money. The point about that I made in my presentation around setting a carbon price, there is a real difference there between the cost to abate and the cost of an offset. And so if you are able to set your carbon price that little bit higher in the order of the 250-degree mark, then really you're setting that with the aim of having a robust offsetting strategy, but really what you're doing is creating additional funding that can be used to do a whole multitude of other things. It can be used to invest in the emergence of credits. It can be used to invest in high social value projects within the local community, within urban environments. There's a whole multitude of things. And I think yes, the offsetting sometimes is needed for a net zero claim, but really the additional finance that can be used through offsetting to kind of bump up that price can be really where the value is in terms of improving lives and biodiversity and beyond the offsetting itself.
Sorry, I was very rudely trying to leaf through my books, trying to find a quote from somebody that I had the pleasure of being on a panel with maybe 2 years ago, and their name is Zai Suri, and they're an activist, environmental activists from the Amazon, and they said, I'm not asking you to save us, I'm asking you to join us in this fight because we're the ones saving you. I'm not going to add anything to that.
Just a very simple recommendation. Always ask how much of the money actually ends up with communities that you're allegedly supporting, right? Because it's almost always not a lot or sometimes nothing, right? It's really quite shocking. And it's really, even with the leading standards, it's very unclear. And as a buyer, that's something that you can really help demand clarity on. Because there are good project developers and bad project developers in this world, and really, really important issue.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, thanks. And there's some really, really good stuff in all of that information you've just given to us, so really thank you. I have a question. First of all, I think the word offsetting is becoming almost not fit for purpose, and it's just too confusing. So kind of removal versus avoidance should be distinguished a lot more clearly, and we should be pushing companies that can afford to and should be investing in removal to do that as a priority. So the actual question I have is whether offsetting should be contained more within the systems boundaries of the industries that are looking to do the credits, the avoidance or the removal, and whether that would promote more collaboration, investment, because the investment and collaboration that's required to actually do the type of removal at those kind of numbers, 200 gigatons or whatever it was in the next couple of decades, is eye-wateringly kind of challenging, and maybe more focus by bounding the notion of dealing with your residual emissions within industry would promote that more and drive more collaboration and investment.
Can I just ask, what do you mean by within systems?
So we operate within the built environment. So the built environment has its value chain, and if you contain the offsetting within that, the aviation industry would be another one, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, so this is another contentious area. for example, I think there's quite a lot of people who think oil and gas companies shouldn't be allowed to buy offsets at all, right? And shouldn't be allowed to claim that and must just focus on reductions. But then also you have that issue of they've got huge amounts of money, right? And they could fund a lot of the stuff that we need to do. That's where the claims issue comes in. I think it's also important to highlight here now, though, that offsetting is becoming a business line for them too. Lots of leading oil and gas companies are also project developers that want to sell this to us as part of their business models. But look, it's going to come down to market design, right? On this exact point, I think you could kind of, and this is where we probably need some regulation. That I think, and if you're taking this seriously as a business, you should be rewarded, and that there are maybe kind of having a certain type of science-based target qualifies you to actually participate in a market that has more integrity or different pricing standards. I don't know, but it's not really something that's been thought that much about, right? We've got, I mean, aviation has its own offsetting. I've forgotten his name. The Corsia, system, but again, I'm sure there'll be problems with that later down the line. Not going to go into them now. Yes, but I get all I'm trying to say is something we've not thought enough about. I think it's a great point.
So first of all, I think you saw me clapping. Can we please just stop saying offset? Because offsetting is actually a verb, not a noun. There isn't really a thing that's called an offset. It's something you do with carbon credits. But also it's become so toxic and so confused that I really try not to say it at all, in the same way that I don't say permanent. So I really wanted to support that. Yes, can we try and get away from the whole concept of offsetting? And related to that is what should companies be allowed to do? Maybe you should be allowed to do offsetting if you do. I just think we need to get away from that whole way of thinking. It's not what you should be allowed to do, it's what you need to do. So it's not, can you use this to get away with that, or you have to have it minimized because of that. What you need to do, really simply, and I wanted to comment again on the price, the internal price that you set. We actually use the social cost of carbon, $185 a tonne, £150 for our removals portfolio, specifically for that reason, because it's a meaningful price. It's actually how much it costs the world if you put the tonne of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's how much you should be paying, we think, in order to take it out. But I think on the topic of, what you should be allowed to do and containing it within a system, we have to, and also removals versus avoidance. I kind of want to get away from that as well, because we kind of need to do it all. So the way that I like to think about it now is you've got your own net zero target, you take responsibility for your own emissions. This is the SBTI saying if you're going to be net zero, you have to reduce this amount, you have to remove the rest. So removals come into your own net zero plan. And then what happens to the rest of avoidance credits, avoidance of deforestation and avoidance of emissions in parts of the global south that can't otherwise pay for it? That's your contribution to net zero for the world. So you've got your own net zero, which is you reduce and you remove. You've got your contribution to net zero for the world. And it shouldn't be how much are you allowed to do. It's how much are you encouraged to do? How much should you be doing to make that contribution, I think, is where we're actually going to get to. And we're only in the headset of how much you'd be allowed to, because cheap offsets have been an excuse for not reducing. And that ship has sailed, that world has gone. It's now about your own net zero means reduce and remove. Your contribution to net zero for the world is contribute to the avoidance that the world needs.
I don't think that world's gone, actually. I think that, without naming names, that a big risk with this is it's bizarre to see extractive companies become project developers themselves, right? And there's a risk there that actually a lot of these credits are nonsense, are rubbish, and do get built into net zero oil or gas or whatever it might be and become a huge distraction. And so I do think that it's at least worth thinking about kind of what a certain industry should be doing, right? Because it's not, I don't know, what's expected of a newspaper is not the same as what's expected of a major oil and gas company in this, right? And that's the point you're trying to get at. And I don't think we're past the era of kind of hot air at all.
And I didn't mean to imply that we're beyond the era of hot air. There's hot air all over the flipping place. I guess what I mean to say is we should be. that should be going, and it will be going, because it doesn't really make sense. But I completely see your point. We need a route out of this for whoever's actually taking it seriously. But I think if we get out of the sense of what you be allowed to do in terms of claiming, then we get more into the space of what should your obligations be, but also a sectoral-based approach. You're absolutely right. What should be expected of different sectors, and what the different sectors can do is actually different. So I agree. We can go all day on this, can't we?
Well,
I mean, the only thing I was going to say is that I think the sense in it is that there are things that we can do within the industry, as you talked about timber, biochar, so on, like that we can do to help removals, and we are within this industry well placed to develop those things. So we should do those things, and we should concentrate on those technologies and sort of help. But also the oh my God, my brain. You see, the thing is, I didn't get enough sleep last night, and I've tried to offset it with coffee, and it's not working. That's it. That's all I've got.
Sure.
The out of sight, out of mind thing. That's the thing. Like, if I think the more that we do, the more that we engage with removals that are connected to the work that we're already doing, then the more meaningful it is. The more money actually ends up in the places and so on. So there's a connection and an actual kind of a human connection and conversations that do then happen through that sense as well, rather than making it somebody else's problem and somebody else walks to Santiago de Compostela for you.
Well, thank you so much all for coming.